Your name is in the Torah code. My name is in the Torah code. The details of your life, the details of my life. For 3,000 years, sages, mystics, and prophets have revered a single mysterious document as the manual that holds the consequences and the outcome for every possible choice that we could ever make in our lives. A time map that holds the details of every major event that has occurred in the last 3,000 years, as well as the consequences that are yet to come. Every query that has ever been made into the mystery of this code has produced results that are statistically significant. They're not random, they're not accidental, and this even goes to the name of every human who has ever been entered into this code. When World War II was queried in the Torah code, it actually spells out the words World War II. It spells out the words final solution. The code gives the name of the leaders who were present at the time: Roosevelt, Stalin, Hitler, Churchill. It gives the exact names of the countries that were involved: England, Germany, France, Russia, Japan, the United States. It even gives the words atomic holocaust in the year 1945. The Torah represents the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that happen to be the first 5 books of the Old Testament in the Christian Bible as well. For at least 1,000 years, Torah scholars, biblical scholars, have suspected that there were hidden codes within the Torah. We're looking at a matrix of 304,805 numbers, exactly, specifically. It is arranged into a matrix, but it's called a dynamic matrix because it is allowed to change, of 64 rows, 4,772 numbers in each row. This is the way it begins. And as the queries begin, the queries determine where that matrix aligns. So the number of numbers in a row and the number of columns can change. It's a dynamic matrix based upon the query that is being offered. A scientific paper was released in the year 1994 in the journal Statistical Science, and it described this Bible code for the first time in scientific terms. The purpose of the paper was to describe an experiment that had been run, and the experiment was to determine if the names of 32 very famous rabbis could be identified using algorithms in the Bible code. Well, without going into all the technical details right here, I'm just going to tell you the results were astounding. They were more than successful. They exceeded all the expectations. Not only were the names of those 32 scholars there, but there was additional information that was not even queried that was coming up with their names. The Torah code is believed now to be a manual for the quantum possibilities that are available within the divine matrix. So we're coming back to this idea that we're living within this field, and within this field, events are unfolding. They are following patterns, they're following cycles. And now it's possible that we actually have a manual that helps us to understand how to interpret those cycles, the consequences of our choices.
Welcome to episode 17 of the Exit Your Matrix show. So I haven't done a reading from Lysander Spooner's Vices Are Not Crimes in quite a while, but let's go ahead and kick this off with some of his very wise words. Now we're on section 8 of this particular book, and it's a pretty long one, so I've done the very difficult task of trying to do my best to pull out the highlights and make this manageable for you. Here we go. We have tried this experiment and determined every question involved in it. We have determined it, not only for ourselves, but for all others. And as to all those who are weaker than we will coerce them to act in obedience to our conclusion. We will suffer no further experiment or inquiry by anyone. Who are the men who have the right to say this? Certainly there are none such. We know, however, that there are such men as these in the world. Some of them attempt to exercise their power only within a small sphere. Others attempt to exercise it on a larger scale. And clearly, no one should surrender his own judgment to the teachings of others unless he first be convinced that these others have something more than ordinary human knowledge on this subject. If those persons who fancy themselves gifted with both the power and the right to define and punish other men's vices would but turn their thoughts inwardly, they would probably find that they have a great work to do at home, and that, when that shall have been completed, they will be little disposed to do more towards correcting the vices of others than simply to give to others the results of their experience and observation. With that out of the way, we're continuing our investigation of the 14 techniques of mind control. And it's important to start out by saying that I've been referring to it as the 14 techniques, but there are certainly more than 14. I'm just covering the ones that I think are most common and prolific and that I have actually seen others use. So I want to begin with a quick recap of the 5 techniques we've covered so far. The first is obfuscation, and this is the process of making an idea or a concept unclear, confusing, or bewildering. So someone in this state of confusion is easily manipulated and controlled. And there are certain types of obfuscation. So we've looked at examples of complexity being obfuscated with simplicity. So we end up saying, everything is so complex, there's no way I can understand it, or at least we're told we can't understand it, so why bother? But the fact is that truth is always simple and elegant. No technocrats needed. The second is the obfuscation of principles with law, or specifically man's law. Principles are irreducible ideas and concepts that last forever. They are with us throughout the entirety of the cosmos, whereas man's law, it's written, it's rewritten, it's repealed, it's amended, it's updated. We've talked about the obfuscation of dominion with the fear of punishment. And of course, in a state of fear, that is the lowest state of consciousness a person can be in within which to make a decision. We've also talked about the obfuscation of gnosis with beliefs, so especially institutionalized belief systems. So gnosis, remember, is knowledge through experience. So actually doing something and understanding how the natural world responds to that, how it reacts to the decisions that you make and the actions that you take, versus institutionalized belief systems, which are simply constructs that we're told about and that we're forced to believe and basically don't, oftentimes when we're very young, we don't have the intellectual ability yet to be able to challenge those. And finally, the obfuscation of self with culture. And that is looking at our individuality and comparing that with what the culture needs and what the culture wants. And things like collectivism and those types of ideas that then lead to socialism, communism, etc., which we touched on in our last episode heavily when we were talking about education. The second technique of mind control we've talked about is worldview poisoning. And this is accomplished in 3 ways. The nature of humanity is the first, and that is basically this issue of nature versus nurture. What exactly is the nature of mankind, of a human being? And as we talked about before, really what we found is that this whole idea of nature really seems to be overblown, and the real action seems to be in nurture, how that individual was treated, what they were taught, what morals they were given, and what were instilled in them. So we've been taught that humanity has some form of nature inherently at birth, but when we really look at it, we find that that nature is probably just a very small set of ingrained and very survival-based type mechanisms that we have as human beings, to be fed and to be sheltered and not be in the elements and be taken care of. Not necessarily the kind of nature that we've been told about. The second is value of oneself. So how do we value ourselves? How is a human being to be valued? What is their worth? And oftentimes we find that that is net worth. In other words, we reduce the value of human beings to numbers and to quantity of possessions and the like. And finally, the elimination of the possibility for change. And we see this in the extinguishment of the imagination. So this is basically that when we take the prior two and we have basically looked at human nature as negative, as evil, and then we say that man's value is only these certain things that we attribute to him or her. So money, possessions, status, a certain level of education, an occupation, etc. Then we set ourselves up for this elimination of the possibility for change because we see people put into these small subgroupings and with these headings and titles, and we can't ever get out of that. We can't ever evolve from that and understand that we can become more than that we are more than that. We have a greater purpose. We've also talked about the exploitation of primal fears, which is another one of these techniques. And this is the subconscious and imprinted mechanisms that we have that have been with us for thousands of years and over endless generations. And these are actually some very basic things. And the first is, they're all fears, of course, and the first is a fear of darkness. So we don't really think about that, but in fact, the fear of darkness is extremely powerful. And the energy, the productivity, and the life that people before us, before we had electricity and artificial light, I mean, the sun was, when it rose and set every day, that was a huge occurrence. We also talked about the fear of predation. So the fear of actual predators, and you combine that with the fear of darkness. When predators come out at night and are looking for food, oftentimes humans a long time ago were the meal, not so much anymore. And so we don't think about this as much, but it is with us. Another one of these primal fears is the fear of abandonment, and typically by a father figure. So what we see here is this plays out in needing to feel that we haven't been abandoned, that we are part of a group, that we are welcome and wanted. And so oftentimes when we don't see this in natural settings, in family and friendships and the like, this is sought elsewhere, and it's sought in forms of control and authority, and particularly with mechanisms of the state. And the final primal fear that we talked about is chaos. So nobody wants chaos. We all want things to be orderly, and so we get from that order out of chaos. We are so fearful of chaos that we buy into, as I've talked about before, and will probably mention in this episode again, we have made this trade of our most important sovereignty and our rights, and we have given that up to accomplish all these other things, so that we aren't in the dark, so that we aren't being pursued by a predator, so that we aren't abandoned, and that so that we can avoid chaos and we can experience and live in order, or at least that's what we think we're trading those rights for. We also talked about divide and conquer, or as I call it, divide and conquer and divide and rule. And this is the exploitation of our perceived differences. It's highly correlated with the technique we'll be discussing today, which is controlled opposition. Finally, in the last two episodes, we looked at the technique of indoctrination, and particularly in education, as you probably saw if you saw those two episodes. And specifically, we see it in Western education. There's actually a quote in the last episode from Charlotte Iserbyt where she says, and this is the first time I'd heard this, that the United States is actually responsible, in her opinion, for the dumbing down of the rest of the world. So this idea of outcome-based education and what it does, turning students into commodities that are really just there for commercial enterprises to snatch up workers. Education as worker training, as I have called it. All right, let's get into today's topic, which is our sixth technique of mind control, and that is controlled opposition. So I'll offer two descriptions of controlled opposition, and the first is this. It's a means of pitting two polarized or seemingly polarized forces against one another such that the required outcome is assured, and that's a key point. When you understand both the ideology of the forces that are involved and the antithesis of those ideologies, putting those forces in an adversarial position to one another creates an assured outcome. A good analogy is chemistry, where the properties of two substances are known, and thus combining them produces an expected and repeatable result. This process is known as a dialectic. A dialectic is the selection of a path one would follow to create a desired outcome. It's a designed vehicle of creation. The two formerly polarizing forces that were pitted against one another result in a synthesis. And notice how familiar this sounds to the topics of magic and sorcery that I covered in a prior episode and that I've linked up here. Recall that both magic and sorcery are the art and science of creating change in the world in accordance with will. In the case of magic, that is the capital W will, the will of creation which is embodied in natural law. And in the case of sorcery, that is the lowercase w will, the egoic and self-centered will. By far the most powerful and widespread dialectic is politics. And does that not meet the textbook scenario of pitting two seemingly polarized forces against one another? So here's a question. What did the designers and major players in our two-party system, really want? For you to be able to embrace your potential as a human being, or for you to continue to be tax and data cattle, subservient citizens of the state, waving your flag and convinced you are a member of the club democracy? So tax and data cattle, what is that? He may not have been the first person to use the term, but I first heard tax cattle from Canadian philosopher Stefan Molyneux. But data cattle, what is that? Well, here's just the latest example.
Automakers collecting data on their drivers and then selling it for profit.
We saw sex life mentioned as data collected in privacy policies. We saw genetic information. We saw medical health information.
And back to politics for a minute. Seriously, folks, do you really believe in this? And even if our controllers were young, fit, and could form complete sentences, would you still believe in it? Would that somehow transform the nature and character of politics from corrupt, authoritarian, technocratic, and tyrannical? And let me offer now that second description of controlled opposition I mentioned before. It's the manipulation of two opposing forces in a drama to create higher ground from which the manipulators can witness and control the conflict that ensues, and then offer a synthesis that is in their interests, not yours. I also want to give you another take on the term dialectic. It's a disputation or debate that is specifically intended to resolve differences between two views rather than to establish one of them as true. And as a side note, Socrates is credited with developing the philosophy around the dialectic, which he deployed by his means of his famous question and answer methodology.
Socrates.
And notice there's nothing sinister here about dialectic by itself. It is a legitimate tool, but sadly very scarcely used, to interact, and it has the potential of creating change. In its simplest form, dialectic is conversation, real conversation. It's two people with differing views coming together, exchanging ideas, and coming away with information or a perspective, or whatever it might be, that has the potential to inform, to change their beliefs. And while conversation and debate are both forms of human communication, they are very different, because debate involves parties who hold, by definition, steadfast to their position for the sole purpose of winning. Conversation, on the other hand, is sharing, with each taking from that exchange something that fosters a genuine desire for truth. Conversation is a positive form of dialectic. The negative form of dialectic we see play out in controlled opposition involves no choice. Have you heard about the connection between black and white tile floors and Freemasons? So I've heard this from numerous sources. This is not my original idea here. And the allegory is to that of a chessboard, with the master manipulating the pieces, that would be us, deliberately and with great care to achieve a desired outcome. And out of that dialectic of politics emerges the most destructive form of controlled opposition the world has ever witnessed, and that is war. Now let's look more carefully at the word opposition as part of controlled opposition. It's tension or conflict or resistance that is expressed in either action or argument. Here's another example: sports. So politics, sports, and all forms of controlled opposition elicit a very important reaction, and that is one of emotional engagement. Specifically, though, it's emotional engagement that is compatible with the level of consciousness of most people, or the people participating in it. It works on what its supporters lack, not have. So in the case of people emotionally engaging in politics, they lack an understanding of themselves and the ability to create change in their own lives. So they substitute and participate in something they believe they have some influence over. They play out their role in the drama often with great enthusiasm, by voting, which is their form of creating change, or what they believe to be creating change. In the case of sports, they lack membership in a community and settle for participation instead in a network. And remember, in the last episode, we heard from John Taylor Gatto talk about the critical differences between communities and networks. Unlike communities, networks have a very narrow way of allowing people to associate, and that way is always across a short spectrum of one, or at most a few, specific uniformities. But why? Well, people buy into controlled opposition because it's easier than thinking. Thinking is hard. But true self-respect dictates that one would never be part of an institution that asks you not to think. Period. Self-respect is a state of absolute clarity that thinking is the most important feature of, and is the source of ascension in consciousness. It's equivalent to the father of the Trinity, if I can use that analogy. And as I pointed out in the past, we do this to ourselves. Because look at how little effort is required for our controllers to manipulate billions of people into replacing the most precious gift they have, their higher order thinking skills, with this.
Oh man! It's embarrassing!
And let's not forget about religion, which I have talked about ad nauseum, so I'm not going to go into it here, but the important part is that we recognize that we are full circle and back again to those worldviews that result from chronic brain hemisphere imbalance. So we have politics for the left-brained and their descent into randomness, where there is no natural order, no rules of the universe. And religion for the right-brained and their steadfast conviction to determinism, where everything plays out according to a preset plan with no potential for influence or change. So before I go into another aspect of controlled opposition, please like, subscribe, share, give me a thumbs up, and as a special offer for all new subscribers, if you're interested, I will record a personalized voicemail greeting from the one and only Mr. Own Nothing and Like It, Klaus Schwab.
Hello, this is Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum. Phyllis is out celebrating her freedom from ownership of private property and can't take your call. Leave your name, intergalactic identification tracing number, and vaccine passport code, and your request will be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Please allow at least 10 business days for a response. May you have a happy and healthy fourth industrial revolution.
And alternatively, if you would like me to give you a voicemail greeting from Mitch McConnell, I can do that as well.
Hello, this is Mitch McConnell.
Okay, let's move into another component of controlled opposition, and that is the Hegelian dialectic. So this was the brainchild of 19th century German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who built upon Socrates' work to develop a model where the opposing parties involved in the dialectic weren't limited to people, as was the case with Socrates and his focus on conversation between two or more parties. They could be ideas, words, terminology, anything really. And before we get into it, keep in mind that despite the modern interpretation of the Hegelian dialectic, it has both positive and negative potentials or connotations. We see this at work today with the Hegelian dialectic being exploited negatively to play forces against one another, but it can have positive outcomes. And it's important to understand the Hegelian dialectic by another name: artificial conflict resolution, meaning that it's manufactured. It's based in conflict between two opposing forces or seemingly opposing forces. And while there is a resolution involved, that resolution always ends up being what the controllers want, or it's consistent with their goals at least. The Hegelian dialectic is the framework for guiding our thoughts and actions into conflicts that lead to predetermined solutions. which is accomplished by the manipulating of consciousness into circular patterns of thought and action. And I've heard this referred to many times as the cul-de-sac before the gold mine. So the cul-de-sac before the gold mine is basically you're headed to the gold mine, you're on your way, and then just before you get there, you start encountering these offshoots, these cul-de-sacs, and they take you nowhere, but they do take you off course. And you look down and you see, well, down that cul-de-sac, those look like some nice houses, and over here, this cul-de-sac has some really nice cars in the parking lot, so maybe that's where the gold is. And so you get distracted and you get led down these false paths. Another way to look at the Hegelian dialectic is Thesis-Antithesis-Synthesis. So this is basically thesis, which is just an idea or an argument, antithesis, which is an opposing idea or argument. And then you play these two together, play them off one another, and a synthesis, which is determined by the controller's results. I'd like to say that it is outcome management through adversary manipulation, meaning that the adversaries, the opposing forces, are manipulated into taking a side that will advance the predetermined agenda. Pick a hand. You pick the left hand. Well, that's going to be a debt-based monetary system, war, a surveillance state, and technocracy. Oh, you pick the right hand. Oh, well, that's entirely different. That's war, technocracy, a debt-based monetary system, and a surveillance state. And then the controllers tell you that those are different things because they were listed in different orders. And as with many of these features, it's ego-based. I will decide among the two options provided to me by the benevolent controllers as to who I must submit to and who I will be ruled by. Try to take my liberties away. This is America, damn it. I'm free in this here democracy. So conflict is the same thing as thesis and antithesis. Unity is synthesis or resolution, predetermined that is. And overwhelmingly, this is the mental model people buy into and rarely break out of. This is an example of what I mean when I say that knowing ourselves is absolutely imperative. That includes knowledge of tendencies we have to fall victim to these kind of tactics. And possessing that knowledge is like psychological jujitsu, giving us very real protections for ourselves against modern predators. I want to pivot now and talk about the New Age paradigm in controlled opposition. The New Age movement grew out of the 1960s. It's a huge body of information with numerous topics and teachers. There are, without a doubt, very powerful truths and outstanding material in the New Age world, but it requires something that is huge in what I've talked about before as one of the tenets of the receptive mind, as I call it, and that is discernment. So this is effectively the way that one goes about evaluating information, and I would say that it typically comes in the form of evaluating the sources of information, because where people get caught up is, I don't like that source of information, or that source of information put out something that I don't agree with, and therefore I can't agree with anything that source says. Well, in being discerning, we have to understand and be extremely careful that we have to separate out the truth from the fiction, because the most effective deceptions will have a very nuanced balance of truth and lies. Think about pest control. Pests won't eat just the poison, so you have to introduce something they like, something sweet or that will at least be palatable to them in order to accomplish the goal. Again, there are some great things about New Ageism, but its major failure is the belief that one should not examine and put energy into the negative. It's the belief that not only the negative elements don't have to be understood, but that exploring them somehow gives that negativity energy. It empowers it. These folks want very badly to believe that by ignoring evil, oppression, tyranny, suffering, that those things will stay at bay. Because who wouldn't want to believe that with the reality of what's going on in the world around us? And I get it. The problem is that it just doesn't work that way. Looking at these forces head on and with an open mind from a perspective of self-defense, understanding how those methods and techniques work is the way to gain your freedom from them. That is knowledge through experience. That is gnosis. And not doing so is escapism, which is a mode of thought and behavior that, above all, seeks the avoidance of discomfort that comes with facing and then exploring what we continue to allow ourselves to be controlled by. And it is us who allows it. And it seems to me that the issue isn't with how we deal with an opposing force. Especially with the level of technology we have, there is no shortage of ways to scout and prepare for a confrontation with an adversary. To me, the issue is that we don't recognize what is happening as even a threat. In large part, humanity has acquiesced. But why? Well, Etienne de la Boétie was a 16th century writer, and he had a real curiosity about that very question. In The Politics of Obedience, this is what he concluded. It is true that in the beginning men submit under constraint and by force, but those who come after them obey without regret and perform willingly what their predecessors had done because they had to. This is why men born under the yoke and then nourished and reared in slavery are content, without further effort, to live in their native circumstance, unaware of any other state or right, and considering as quite natural the condition into which they were born. There is, however, no heir so spendthrift or indifferent that he does not sometimes scan the account books of his father in order to see if he is enjoying all the privileges of his legacy or whether, perchance, his rights and those of his predecessor have not been encroached upon. Nevertheless, it is clear enough that the powerful influence of custom is in no respect more compelling than in this, namely, habituation to subjugation. So there you have it. It's habitual. And in acquiescing, we commit the sin of not acting. And this is not a sin against any deity, but against the universe, against creation. And as we've discussed, the universe respects unity and care over division and apathy every time, regardless of the intent, whether it be light or dark. And that is a huge point because it's the answer to that question of how bad people and institutions continue to be successful. Because they're united and they use their personal currency on their goal. They spend their time on it and they pay attention to it. And what does the average person spend their time on and pay attention to? In the end, all this results in us being taken off the path of enlightenment, and what I'll continue to say is the root causal factor of human suffering. And that is humanity giving up its precious sovereignty, the gift of creation, in exchange for comfort and perceived safety. And the way out is not to avoid, not to duck. The way out is through. It's gnosis, through knowledge. All right, so let's close our discussion of controlled opposition, the 6th of 14 techniques of mind control, with some brief but very poignant words from one of my all-time favorites, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, or I must admit, as I once called him, Goethe. Divide and rule, the politician cries. Unite and lead is watchword of the wise. I hope you'll join me next time when we move into one of the biggest mind control techniques out there, and that is the monetary system. Thank you for taking the time to join me today, and remember to always do your own thinking. Until then, be well.